Bessie just loved being out in the middle of the dew-covered fields in the early morning sunshine. She knew that she shouldn't be here. She'd been told often enough by her mum and dad, and she could hear their stern voices in her head as she danced amongst the buttercups and daisies. But right here, on the edge of the new pit, she felt as happy as a 4-year-old could feel. It had been easy for her to make her way out of the crowded bed at the top of the house, but the squeak of the latch and the creak of the front door had nearly woken everyone in the house. Having to share a room with her 7 brothers and sisters was one thing, but Ginny's elbows were as sharp as an axe when she tossed and turned in her sleep, and Bessie had had enough. Dressing as the sun rose, she was determined that she would go and see her dad as he came home from the mine, and, with her grandma's old teddy under her arm, she started to make her way up the great pile of dusty black coal that made the green of the field look even greener. "You keep me safe, won't you?" She hugged at the worn neck of the small white teddy in her arms. This was a precious toy. In fact, it was the only toy that she had in all of this world, and she took him everywhere with her. As she scrambled on, she reached a flattened place in the great stinking pile of coal, and she could see over the manager's high brick wall and into his beautifully tended garden. It was the yellow of the flowers that first caught her eye, but the smell of the apples, juicy, green and ripe, that cut right through the industrial stench all about her. Sure he wouldn't miss one. Not just one apple. He's got so many, and I've only got. She paused in her thinking out loud as she squeezed the teddy in her arms even more tightly. I've only got you and my dad. For the moment she had forgotten about the whole of her snoring family, and for the moment she had forgotten about the things she'd been told by her mother and father about stealing. Quick as a blink of an eye, she was down by the fence at the front of the garden and under the rusty wire and into the manager's orchard. The apple trees were groaning under the weight of their rich bounty of fruit, and many had fallen onto the soft green earth below. If she was to pick one up from off the ground, then she didn't have to take it from the tree, and it seemed even less like stealing. Bessie rubbed a fine round green apple on the front of her pinafore dress. She'd been so careful to keep it clean when she'd first got it, but now, what with her adventures on the coal heap, the cotton of its cloth, well, it was streaked with black and grime, but she just didn't care. The apple was now hers, and she was going to give it to her dad. She could imagine the huge, black-rimmed grin on his face as he took a bite out of it, and he rubbed at her tousle hair in the early morning sunlight as they made their way back home together. She had a smile on her face as she slipped out of the garden and started to go across the coal heap once more. Now that she was dirty, she didn't really care if she got any dirtier, and she was dancing in between the huge mounds of coal and making for the field at the side of the pit head. She leapt, she bounced, she skidded and slipped on the shining black lumps of coal. If she had walked slowly and carefully, then she would have made it safely to the other side, but care and safety were words you could never use when Bessie was about. Her mother would laugh at her and scold her. "You, Bessie, you're as clumsy as a cart horse in a market." It was true. She was clumsy, and now she was slipping in the greasy coal, and it was sliding all around her. First, she couldn't move her legs, and then she was trapped up to her waist. She wanted to be anywhere else but here, and when she couldn't move at all, she let out a great wail of a tear-stained scream that would have woken up the world, if the world had been listening. She was far away from home, and too far away from her friends, and no one could hear her, no one except the farmer. He wasn't too pleased that the pit had dropped all of its coal on his good pasture land, so he was no friend to the coal miners or the managers. Stopping the two great horses in front of him with a click of his tongue and a "Come on, you varmints," he had a curious smile on his face when he saw her. "Well, whatever next? Talk and scream and coal. I've seen many things, but I've never seen coal that could talk." He was laughing now as he took a closer look at her, stuck right up to her waist in the coal. Bessie did look as black as the heaped coals around her, and all that could really be seen of her was the white of her eyes and the pink tear stains down her blackened cheeks. "Please, please, please get me out!" Her voice was like a foghorn, but it only made the farmer laugh again. "Why, that's a mighty big voice for such a small girl, but I suppose I'd better get you out before they hoy you on the fire as well." He reached for a lead rope on the bigger of the two horses, and with a practised, quick flick of his strong hands, it was around her. She hung on for all that she was worth, and was dragged out of the clutches of the coal. He couldn't stop himself from smiling as he looked at her as she scrambled to her feet, scratched and bruised, bleeding from her shin, and whimpering in front of him. "You've got yourself in a right old pickle, and that's for sure. Black as the ace of spades you are. I'll get my missus to clean you up, and get you back to your house before your mum and dad find you missing." He looked at her in the way that the vicar would look at a naughty choir boy. "But if I was to clean you up and get you home, what are you going to give me? Nothing comes from nothing, and you've got to pay for my help. What have you got, young Bessie?" She was still clutching at her teddy, and there was no way that she would give him up. The only thing that she had was the apple. With dust-covered fingers, she pulled it from the pocket of her dress and put it in front of the farmer. An apple. A green apple. A ripe, green, juicy apple. "Well, I ain't no teacher, but I want to know where you got that apple from." Too frightened to speak, she nodded her head towards the manager's garden. The farmer sucked in his breath, and looked for all the world as if he was going to sentence her to death for being a thief. But he couldn't hold his laughter in any more. "That'll do nicely, I think." Her hand looked so small compared to the great spade of a fist he had at the end of his arms, and before she knew it, he had put her up on the back of the great brown horse, and they were walking towards his old cottage. "This tastes all the sweeter 'cause you got it from them." He spat the words out, and the juice of the apple was on his unshaven chin. Bessie had wanted to give the apple to her father, but she was grateful for the help the farmer was giving her. See, she secretly hoped that he would let her have some, maybe half, perhaps a bite of the apple. But her hopes faded as he crunched and munched at the manager's apple. He saw this apple as a victory over those who had stolen his good pasture, and he was not going to share his moment of triumph with anybody. As the farmer's wife wrapped her up in a great woolen blanket, and watching her clothes dry by the farmer's roaring fire, Bessie asked if she could have at least the core of the apple. "Of course you can." The farmer smiled as he handed over the pips, stalk, and the last remaining flesh of the apple. "You be good now, and don't you turn yourself into no more talking coal." He chuckled as he went out to finish his work in the fields. True to his word, with the farmer's wife's help, she was back at home before anyone had noticed that she had gone, and she was slipped inside of her bed, with Ginny's razor-sharp, but somehow now friendly, elbows digging in her ribs. At breakfast, her mother looked at Bessie in a strange way, for her daughter had woken up cleaner than when she had gone to bed, and Bessie, concentrating on her food, was not going to tell her about all or any of her adventures. What she did do was to put the pips into the warm soil at the back of the house, and as the years went by, the seeds became an apple tree that grew tall and strong, just as Bessie turned from a little girl to a kind and sensible woman. In the autumn sunshine, she would dance beneath its branches, loaded with fruit, and if she ever thought about having an adventure, she would touch the small, thin, blue, coal dust scar at the front of her shin, and remember a little girl dancing amongst the buttercups and daisies. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and a devil of a toll takes he. For he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children 3. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and a devil of a toll takes he. For he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children 3. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and a devil of a toll takes he. For he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children 3. As soon as old Mrs. McGlashan came near to the pit, everyone started to panic. Managers, foremen, chairmen, workmen were all scared of this frail old woman. No one was spared her smile and her piercing eyes, yet her voice was as sweet as an angel's wing upon the air, and she looked as if she would never harm a fly. It was what she said and how she said it that really hurt. She could make the words, "You are no longer needed here, and you will leave this pit before the hour is done," sound as if she was asking you to dance a waltz at the Tivoli. Her hair was flame red, and although her back was bent, she could still make you feel as if you were a child again, as if you had been dragged to the headmistress's office to receive a severe caning. She knew very well the effect she had on all of these men, and she liked the way that her power made them quake and quiver. She had no doubt that they would spit out her name behind her back, not only for being so ruthless, but for the very fact that she was the boss of this place. What really brought a cheer to her heart was the fact that they despised her for the fact that she was a woman. Had it not been for the death of her husband, Sir Charles McGlashan, she would still have been nothing more and nothing less than the wife of the boss. Prior to her being made a widow, they never even gave her a glance, and now she was repaying them for their lack of courtesy by giving them some of their own medicine. "Good morning, gentlemen," she purred as a high-backed red plush velvet seat was placed for her at the head of the committee room. "It is so good to see that you are all busy. You know what my Charles would say now, don't you?" They did, but they squirmed as she took delight in repeating what her late husband had said. As she sat, she trilled, "A working pit needs to be filled with labour. From the darkness comes the light, and—" She looked into the eyes of these men who depended on her as the pit owner for their jobs. "And it is our job, it is our job to labour to bring the coal that brings the light to the working world." Fully rested in the seat, she clapped her hands, and the meeting began. "Remember, gentlemen, from the darkness comes the light." Outside of the oak-panelled doors, it was her voice that could be heard the most. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that this 89-year-old, strong-willed woman had a mind of her own in a male-dominated industry. The clapping of her grey-gloved hands signalled the end of the meeting, and as she handed the reports marked "Profits and Loss for the year ended 1910" to her chauffeur, she turned back, just in time to see the deputy manager cursing her. He nervously pulled at his moustache and cleared his throat, but she knew what he thought of her and her woman's ways. Still looking straight at him, she whispered, "Gentlemen, you know how much I enjoy your company on my weekly visits to the pit, and—" Here she almost smiled as she spoke. "And I look forward to seeing most of you next week. Goodbye, till Tuesday week." Many of the men almost fell over trying to bow as she went from the committee room, and as the door closed behind her, she could hear them bark and howl in pain as they thought that some of them may not be in her employment within the week. She took her chauffeur's arm as they made their way to the silver Bentley at the steps of the office. "Good. I like to keep them guessing. It means that they will all work and try and work extra hard to keep their jobs." What happened next took Emily McGlashan's breath away because, from out of nowhere, a pitman, straight from the coalface, rushed towards her with a box in his hand and a smile on his face. He hurriedly pulled his cap from his head, and she could see that under all of the coal dust he had straight brown hair. "Lady McGlashan!" He could barely speak, he was so excited. "Lady McGlashan! Lady McGlashan! I've made this for you!" He pushed a crudely made but beautifully carved wooden box towards her. She was shocked. She was more than shocked. She was outraged. She liked the money that the mine gave her. She loved the life that she had, with its fine wines and holidays in the sun. But this filthy pitman had the nerve to talk to her, and now expected her to take something that looked as if it had been made inside of his hovel. Benjamin Lomond was well known throughout the whole of the village for his fine craftsmanship. Many would have seen this as a great privilege, but Emily signalled to her chauffeur to take the box as she scurried into the car. Ben thought that she would like what he had given her. He was the third generation to have worked at the pit, and he was glad of the work that he and his father and grandfather had done for the McGlashan family. It was his way of showing the old lady how much he appreciated being able to keep a roof over his family's head. Putting his coal-heavy cap back on his head, he smiled to himself when he thought of what the old lady would say when she took a good look inside of the box he'd made. Lady McGlashan didn't utter a word until the middle of the evening. She had been silent in the dining room. She hadn't even complained about the food, which made the undercook very scared indeed. In fact, she and half of the scullery staff had packed their bags in anticipation of being cast out of the house the very next morning. It was as the last embers of the log fire were burning that she called for a driver to bring the box to her. As it was put down on the brass-topped table, she could tell that it was heavy, and despite herself, she was curious as to what mysteries it held. With the slightest wave of her fingers, she indicated that she wanted it to be opened for her.